I am mixing up sort of a base colour for the rocks to start with. So I'm looking for the lightest colours, so starting off with Hansa Yellow Light, Hansa Yellow Deep, and I'm mixing up a sort of a light limey green here using some turquoise. I'm actually wetting all of the kind of rocks here with a large mop brush. And the water is slightly tinted so I can see where I'm going, and there is kind of an underpainting of a pale yellow, so that's fine. Loading my brush with the lightest colour and dropping it in wet into wet, so the surface is the same consistency of wetness that my brush is. So I'm just dropping it in here and there. I'm closely looking at the photograph just to see where these sort of yellow sort of areas are, and there's sort of leaves and wildflowers. This is the light green. I'm dropping that in wet into wet here. Just using this large mop brush. Fully load your brush. So this is the Hansa Yellow Deep, which is almost an orangey colour. So again, I'm dropping this in wet. This is the Quinacridone Gold. If you don't have this colour, don't worry, you could use raw sienna. Using this large mop brush, which really holds a lot of paint, it allows you to be free as well. Sometimes to loosen up, use large brushes and fully load them, especially at this first stage. So this is a little bit of burnt umber. Mixed with ultramarine, you can use burnt sienna as a substitute to the burnt umber. I'm painting damp into wet. Dark to light, remember, so it will really make the waterfall stand out. Using the tip of my brush, I'm just painting damp into damp there, allowing the paint to kind of flow a little bit, but not as much as wet into wet. So one of the techniques I'm going to use is the plastic card technique. So I'm just swiping here to create some light and textures on some of the rocks. I will put a link in the description below of a more in-depth plastic card tutorial where I show you how to do these techniques, and you may find it helpful. For my second technique, I'm using a watercolour pencil and sandpaper. Rubbing the tip of the watercolour pencil against the sandpaper allows the pigment to fall onto the damp paper, so it fixes itself there and it creates wonderful delicate textures. And you can use whatever colours you like, especially sort of darker colours against a lighter background will look really effective. So I'm just going to use some water with a large mop brush just to sort of add a little bit of lighter colours here, almost wet into wet. And what you get from that is possible cauliflowers and blooms by dropping in kind of a watery wash into a damp or drying wash. So try that out. It creates the most amazing textures. For my fourth technique, I'm using granulation fluid and a pipette, dropping it in onto the damp paint just here and there. It works really well with granulating paints as well. So my ultramarine should work really well with the burnt sienna. The other thing that works really well with granulation fluid is gravity. So it's good to tilt it, and you can see the paint starts to break down. It does create the most fascinating textures, and it's just something you can play around with. And as you can see here, as I'm tilting, the paint is flowing and it does create wonderful textures. I love this, and I use Winsor & Newton's granulation fluid. I find it works the best for me. So as you can see here, I'm literally tilting at 90 degrees, allowing the paint to flow down. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a mid-green using sap green, but you could use phthalo blue with some Hansa Yellow Light or lemon yellow, and just painting damp into damp, some grasses in the foreground, and I'm now spattering. Spattering is my fifth technique, which I love to do, and I'm spattering this sort of limey green colour just here and there to create the look of lighter foliage, and also light yellow wildflowers here using my size 8 round brush. It's kind of wet into damp as well, so you may get some interesting textured effects. Remember to mask out your water. I used my hand there. So now I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 brush with a very dilute cerulean with a pinch of the burnt umber or burnt sienna, softening the edge here so it doesn't look like a jigsaw puzzle or a cutout, and it makes it look a little bit more realistic. I'm working light to dark here. A little bit of ultramarine now into the cerulean, and I'm just going to paint that damp into wet. It was a bit too blue, so I've got a pinch of burnt sienna or burnt umber, and I'm just painting this sort of blue-grey colour with the tip of my brush, damp into damp, to create the sort of shadows in this sort of rushing water here. Mixing up some creamy ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna and painting sort of the darker shadowy areas here in the water. Almost horizontal there, using the belly of the brush, which is what I pointed to there. It's the middle of the brush, not the tip. So when you use the belly, sometimes you get a nice dry brush sparkle effect because the paint doesn't flow from the middle of the brush like it does if you tilt it and paint from the tip of the brush. Try it out, it's a fun technique, especially on textured paper like cold pressed or rough paper. Remember, here I'm working wet on dry, just softening and blending more of the ultramarine and burnt sienna mix and just adding details, painting damp into damp here. So I'm using the sort of dry brush, side brush here to create some of the water. The colour in the water here is kind of a cerulean with a bit of phthalo blue, really watered down. I'm leaving lots of white of the paper and I'm using horizontal straight lines. I'm just painting a little bit of reflection here, damp into damp with the ultramarine and burnt sienna, mixing up some of the phthalo blue with the ultramarine with a pinch of yellow to paint a really lovely turquoisey colour in the foreground along with the ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm mixing up creamy Paynes grey with burnt umber or burnt sienna and just sort of painting the edge of the waterfall, both damp into damp sort of on the left hand side but wet on dry as I sort of paint into the waterfall, and then drizzling some of that lovely sort of granulation fluid there. Adding some darks here around this sort of very warm rock in the sort of middle to the right of the painting here. So again, using the ultramarine and burnt sienna, painting damp into damp here on the right hand side of the rocks and underneath where it's darkest, again damp into damp, using Paynes grey and burnt sienna, adding a little bit more dark here to this bottom rock, a little bit more shadows using my size 8 round brush. Just adding some dark shadows in the water here using the ultramarine and burnt sienna, damp into damp, just building up almost these abstract shapes, some horizontal, but as they're flowing down into the water beneath, they're kind of sloping and diagonal. And just spattering some darks here as well, just using the burnt umber and the Paynes grey, just here and there onto the damp paper. Sprinkling some salt onto the damp surface. What the salt will do, it will absorb the paint as it dries, as the paint dries, and will create some lovely natural textured effects which are gorgeous. I love using this technique. Just a few more marks in the water. I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. Once it's dry, I just brush the salt off with the paper towel. My next technique is masking fluid. And I'm actually masking out the sort of light grasses, not just the white of the paper. So it's quite a nice way of masking areas. And what I'm doing is I'm just masking out some branches here and also some other light areas. So I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. So I'm mixing up some watery dark glazes here. I've mixed up some Paynes grey with a bit of green here. You can use sap green. Rinsing my brush, I'm mixing up some quinacridone gold here with a little bit of watered down ultramarine with burnt sienna. Lots of water in there, as you can see. It's a sort of a greyish, greenish blue. Using some of that colour to mix below there. You could have Paynes grey in there with ultramarine and just vary your colours. This is ultramarine here with phthalo blue and some turquoise here. So I've got a real selection of very dilute but dark colours, and I'm going to glaze over the masking fluid areas with my large mop brush, painting wet on dry. So I don't want to lose all my textures, and that's why I'm using glazes. Glazes are very thin washes that read as a sort of a dark area, darks and details here and there, bringing these rocks and foliage to life, but also softening edges with a clean wet brush. So really loading my brush with green here. You can use sap green with Paynes grey to make it darker, and just painting wet on dry here with my size 8 brush, sort of darker grasses, adding some more of that sort of warm Hansa yellow deep, just to really bring those grasses forward. More dark here with the Paynes grey, with a pinch of the Quin gold, and I'm mixing up some Paynes grey here with a little bit of ultramarine, and I'm just painting wet on dry the shadows on the rocks here. And I've mixed up a darker colour here that's using the Paynes grey, and I'm just painting wet on dry the sort of negative shape, the background behind this rock, to bring out the light of the rock on top. And I'm adding a few more darks here to the left hand side of the rock as well, using a clean wet brush. So I'm mixing up here a sort of a dilute puddle of cerulean with a pinch of Paynes grey. I'm painting some of the shadows on the water wet on dry with my size 10 round brush, again softening and blending with a clean wet brush. Apply these darker shadow colours. So if you are afraid of the dark, this is a great technique to try, to actually mask out your light areas, and then you can liberally apply these darks once the masking fluid is dry. So I'm painting a pattern of darks here using Paynes grey, little bit of ultramarine there, using my size 2 round brush, so it's lots of detail here, and just applying these darker marks, either wet on dry or damp into damp. So just adding some darks here. Remember to have the flow of the water going in the direction, coming down, and as you go into the water in the foreground, it's all horizontal marks. So just adding a few more darks to the water and to the rock here on the right, using my size 8 round brush, still using that burnt sienna mixed with the Paynes grey, maybe cerulean mixed with the Paynes grey, and just continuing to sort of half close my eyes to see these sort of dark or mid-tone abstract marks. I'm just sort of letting this brush dance around here on the right hand side as well, creating lots of squiggly marks, and it's so much fun to do. So a little bit more of the burnt umber mixed with the Paynes grey, I'm spattering on top of that rock there to create texture as well. So adding burnt sienna and Paynes grey, and just sort of painting the sort of dark edge of this rock here to pull it away from the water. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. Once the painting is thoroughly dry, I'm using some tape. Masking tape or framing tape work perfectly just to remove the masking fluid. And once the masking fluid is removed, you can just finesse your painting to finish off with darks, details and light. So I'm using the Reservoir brush. You can use the rigger, painting wet on dry, some darks and details here of a branch sort of going over the waterfall, but also adding some darks to the waterfall here and there. And just let your brush dance here just to add these details. I love the light that the masking fluid has left as well there. So you've got light and darker marks. So just adding some lighter grasses here using the Hansa yellow light with a pinch of cerulean with the Reservoir brush, and just it paints these beautiful thin light lines that you can sort of almost cross into the water as well. So spattering the limey green here using my size 2 round brush. The smaller the brush, the smaller the marks when you're spattering, and it creates sort of highlights and details. This is the Hansa yellow deep. It creates a lovely warm light yellow, and I can't help myself. I just go mad when I'm spattering. I should always say to myself, less is more. With spattering, it always seems to be more is less or more is more. But I'm actually spattering some white gouache. Now, this is my secret weapon to finishing a painting. One is to spatter, but it's also to use the white gouache just so it stops me from over painting. So I'm using it to create some splashes here in the waterfall, but also adding some more lights. If you've lost your light, just use the white gouache. I'm using it here because I've sort of overplayed my hand with some of that dark in the waterfall, so I can just push it back with the white gouache there, using my size 2 round brush, working wet on dry. Horizontal dry brush strokes here in the water in the foreground there, using the belly of the brush as well. This is my size 4 round brush. So I'm going to remove the washi tape. It reveals a lovely white border, and it does give me time to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. Don't you just love all those textures created by the salt, the spattering, the masking fluid, the granulation fluid, the watercolour pencils and the plastic card, etc, etc. I threw it all at this painting and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that it inspires you to have a go at painting this waterfall scene. If you have any questions about this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. If you would like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You could get access to my weekly exclusive tutorials, downloadable outline sketches, and you can cancel anytime. More details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.